The letter fell to the floor before Alara Whitmore even finished reading it, and the room went silent. Her mother snatched it up first, her eyes scanning the elegant black script, and then her face changed in a way Alara had never seen before. Shock, disbelief, something close to anger. "This cannot be right," her mother said, her voice shaking. "There must be a mistake." Alara stood frozen by the window, her hands still trembling from having held the letter only seconds ago. She did not understand what was happening. She only knew that whatever was written on that paper had turned her mother's face pale, and that was never a good sign in the Whitmore household. "What is it?" Camille asked, stepping into the room with the calm confidence she always carried. She was the elder sister, the one everyone adored, the one whose name was spoken with pride at every dinner party in town. She reached for the letter without waiting for permission. Her mother did not stop her. Camille read it once, then twice. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes were fixed not on her mother, but on Alara. "This says your name," Camille said slowly, as though she were testing whether the words made any sense at all. "It says Alara Whitmore is invited to dine with the Duke of Ashcombe, tomorrow evening, at his estate." The room fell into a silence so heavy that Alara could hear her own heartbeat. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in the county had heard of Duke Alaric Vaughan. He was the kind of man people whispered about at gatherings, not because he attended them, but because he never did. He had inherited his title young, after a loss that no one spoke of directly, and since then he had become something of a mystery. Some said he was cold. Others said he was simply tired of a world that only ever wanted something from him. He rarely left his estate, rarely accepted guests, and never in living memory had he invited anyone to a private dinner. Until now. And somehow, impossibly, the name on that invitation was hers. "There has been a mistake," her mother repeated, folding the letter as if that alone could undo what was written on it. "It was meant for Camille. It must have been meant for Camille." Alara said nothing. She had learned long ago that there was little use in arguing when her mother had already decided what was true. In this house, Camille was the daughter who mattered. Camille was the one who received new dresses each season, who was taught to dance and to speak with grace, who was paraded in front of visiting families as though she were a prize to be won. Alara was the quiet one, the plain one, the one who mended the torn hems and carried the tea trays and was rarely asked her opinion on anything at all. She had stopped expecting much from her family a long time ago. It hurt less that way. "Perhaps the Duke's secretary made an error," her mother continued, pacing now, her slippers tapping softly against the wooden floor. "Perhaps he confused the names. It happens. These things happen." "Mother," Camille said, holding the letter out again, "it says Alara, not once but twice. Here and again at the bottom, where it asks that she confirm her attendance in writing." Her mother took the letter back and read it a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves if she looked hard enough. They did not. Alara finally found her voice. "I did not ask for this," she said quietly. "I do not even know the Duke. I have never met him." "Then why would he ask for you?" her mother snapped, though the anger in her voice was not truly meant for Alara. It was meant for the situation itself, for a piece of fortune that had landed in the wrong hands. No one in the room had an answer. Alara picked up the letter from where her mother had set it down and read it for herself, slowly this time, taking in every word. The handwriting was neat and formal, clearly the work of a secretary rather than the Duke himself, but the words were plain enough. She was invited to dine at Ashcombe Hall the following evening. A carriage would be sent for her at 6 o'clock. She was asked to reply with her confirmation before noon. There was no explanation, no reason given, just an invitation addressed to her and her alone. Her hands were still shaking as she set the letter down on the table. That night sleep did not come easily. Alara lay awake in the small room at the back of the house, the one with the narrow bed and the window that let in too much cold air in winter, and she stared at the ceiling, turning the strange invitation over and over in her mind. Why her? She thought of every possible explanation. A clerical error, as her mother insisted, seemed the most likely. Perhaps the Duke's staff had simply written the wrong name, confusing one Whitmore sister for another. It would not be the first time Alara had been overlooked or mistaken for someone else. People rarely noticed her long enough to remember her name correctly. But if that were true, why would her name appear twice, exactly as her sister had pointed out? A single mistake could be explained. Two identical mistakes were harder to dismiss. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes, trying to imagine what the evening ahead might hold. She had never been inside Ashcombe Hall, though she had passed its towering iron gates many times on the road into town. From a distance, the estate always looked quiet, almost lonely, its windows dark even in the evenings when every other house in the county glowed with candlelight. People said the Duke kept to himself, that he took his meals alone, that he had not hosted a proper gathering since his father passed and left him the title far too young. What kind of man lived like that by choice? She did not know, and the not knowing kept her awake long after the house had gone quiet. By morning, her mother had already decided how the evening would go. "You will go," she said over breakfast, her tone leaving no room for discussion, because it would be unwise to insult a duke by refusing his invitation, mistake or not. "But you will make it clear, gently, that Camille would be a far more suitable guest for any future occasion." Alara nearly laughed at the absurdity of it, though she kept her expression still. She was being sent to dinner not because anyone believed she deserved to be there, but because it would be improper to say no, and because her family hoped she might somehow use the evening to promote her sister instead. Camille, for her part, said little that morning. She watched Alara with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet resentment. She had spent her whole life being the daughter everyone wanted, and now, for the first time, something desirable had gone to her sister instead. Alara could see that it unsettled her, even if Camille was too composed to say so directly. "What will you wear?" Camille asked eventually, breaking the silence. Alara looked down at herself, at the simple gray dress she wore most days, the one with the small tear near the hem that she had mended so many times the stitches had become part of the pattern. She did not own anything suited for dining with a duke. "I do not know," she admitted. Camille studied her for a long moment, and then, surprisingly, she rose from the table and left the room without another word. She returned a few minutes later carrying a deep blue gown, one Alara recognized as one of Camille's own, though it was simpler than most of her sister's dresses, less adorned, more the kind of thing a person might wear if they wanted to look elegant without appearing as though they were trying too hard. "Wear this," Camille said, holding it out. Alara stared at it, unsure what to make of the gesture. It was not like Camille to give anything away freely, least of all something that might make her sister look presentable for an evening that, by all rights, should have belonged to her. "Why?" Alara asked. Camille shrugged, though the movement was not as careless as she likely intended it to seem. "Because you cannot go looking like you borrowed a dress from the kitchen maid," she said. "Whatever happens tonight, you are still a Whitmore. Try to remember that even if no one else does." It was not warmth, not exactly, but it was something close to it, and Alara found herself holding the dress a little more tightly than necessary. The rest of the day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the one before it. Alara tried to occupy herself with small tasks, mending, sweeping, anything to keep her mind from circling back to the evening ahead, but nothing worked for long. By the time the afternoon light began to soften and turn gold across the fields outside, her nerves had settled into a steady, quiet hum beneath her skin. She dressed carefully, smoothing the blue gown over her shoulders, pinning her hair the way she had seen Camille do 100 times before, though her hands were far less practiced. When she looked at herself in the small, spotted mirror in her room, she almost did not recognize the person looking back. She looked, for the first time in a long while, like someone who might belong somewhere important. The carriage arrived exactly at 6 o'clock, just as the letter had promised. It was a fine carriage, dark and polished, drawn by two matched horses, and the driver stepped down to open the door for her with a formality she had never experienced in her life. Her mother watched from the doorway with an expression caught somewhere between pride and disapproval. Camille stood a few steps behind, arms folded, saying nothing. As the carriage pulled away from the house, Alara looked back once. Her family grew smaller in the distance, the house shrinking behind the hedges, until finally the road curved and they disappeared from view entirely. She faced forward again, her heart pounding, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ahead of her lay Ashcombe Hall, and a man she had never met, and an evening that would end up changing the entire course of her life, though she had no way of knowing that yet. All she knew, as the carriage rolled steadily down the long country road, was that for the first time in as long as she could remember, someone had asked for her. Not her sister. Her. And whatever waited for her at the end of that road, she intended to find out why. The carriage came to a stop before iron gates far taller than Alara had imagined from the road, and for a moment she simply sat still, unable to make her hand reach for the door. A footman opened it for her before she could decide whether she was ready. Ashcombe Hall rose in front of her like something out of a story, gray stone walls climbing 3 floors high, windows glowing faintly with candlelight in a way that surprised her, since she had always heard the house described as dark and empty. Somehow, tonight, it did not look empty at all. It looked like it was waiting. She stepped down from the carriage, smoothed the blue gown with both hands, and walked toward the great front doors on legs that did not feel entirely her own. A tall man in formal dress met her at the entrance, his expression polite but unreadable. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing slightly. "The Duke is expecting you. My name is Nathaniel Cross, his secretary. Please follow me." She followed him through a wide hall lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, past a staircase that curved upward into shadow, until they reached a set of double doors. Nathaniel knocked once, then opened them without waiting for a reply. "Miss Alara Whitmore, Your Grace." The room beyond was smaller than she expected, warmer too, lit by a fire crackling low in the hearth, and a long table set for 2. And there, standing near the window with his back to her, was the Duke of Ashcombe. He turned as she entered, and Alara found herself unable to look away. He was younger than she had pictured, perhaps 30, with dark hair and tired eyes that seemed to carry more weight than his years should have allowed. He was not smiling, though he did not look unkind either. He simply looked like a man who had grown used to being alone and was not entirely certain what to do with company. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice quiet, "thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied, dropping into a curtsy that felt clumsy compared to the practiced grace Camille always managed. He gestured toward the table. "Please sit. I imagine you have questions." "I have several," Alara admitted, taking her seat across from him. "The first being why I am here at all." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile but close to one. "Direct," he said. "I was told the Whitmore sisters were known for their charm, not their honesty." "I am told many things about my family that are not entirely accurate," Alara said before she could stop herself, and then immediately regretted how sharp it sounded. To her surprise, the Duke laughed. It was brief, almost startled, as though the sound had escaped him before he could decide whether to allow it. "Forgive me," he said. "I have not laughed at a dinner table in a long time. I had forgotten what it felt like." The first course was served, a light soup that Alara barely tasted, her attention too fixed on the man across from her. She had expected coldness, formality, the kind of distant politeness she imagined came naturally to men of his rank. Instead, he seemed almost as uncertain as she was, his fingers tapping lightly against the stem of his glass, his eyes flicking toward her and then away, as though he were working up the courage to speak plainly. "I owe you an explanation," he said finally, "for the invitation." "I would appreciate one," Alara said. "My family assumed it was meant for my sister." "It was not a mistake," he said. "I asked for you specifically." Alara set down her spoon. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. 3 months ago, I attended a gathering in town, one of the few I have not been able to avoid. Your sister was there, of course. Everyone noticed her. She is difficult not to notice. She usually is, Alara said, unable to keep a trace of old resentment from her voice. But you were there too, he continued, standing near the edge of the room, watching everything and saying very little. At one point, a young woman was mocked rather cruelly for stumbling during a dance, and while everyone else laughed, you were the only person who crossed the room to help her up. Alara blinked, caught off guard. She barely remembered the incident. It had felt so small at the time, hardly worth noting. She had not realized anyone had seen it, least of all a man she had never even spoken to. I asked who you were, the Duke continued. No one seemed to know much, only that you were the younger Whitmore sister, the quiet one. I found that I could not stop thinking about it. In a room full of people performing kindness for an audience, you were the only one who showed it when you thought no one important was watching. Alara did not know what to say. She had spent so many years believing herself invisible that the idea of being watched, truly watched, by someone who mattered, felt almost impossible to accept. I am not accustomed to being noticed, she admitted quietly. Neither am I, the Duke said, not truly. People notice my title, they notice what I can offer them. It has been a long time since anyone looked at me and saw simply a man. There was something raw in the way he said it, something that told her this admission had cost him more than he let on. She thought of the rumors she had heard growing up, the whispers about a broken engagement, a loss no one spoke of directly, a young duke who had shut himself away from society not out of arrogance but out of something closer to grief. May I ask you something personal, she said carefully. He met her eyes. You may ask, I cannot promise I will answer. Why do you live so far from everyone? People say you rarely leave this house. His jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment she feared she had gone too far. But then he set down his glass and spoke, his voice lower than before. I was engaged once, several years ago. It ended badly and not in a way I care to discuss over dinner. Since then I have found that solitude is far less complicated than company. People want things from a duke, land, money, a title to attach to their family name. It becomes difficult to know who wants you and who wants what you represent. And which do you think I want? Alara asked, the question slipping out before she could soften it. He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his expression. I do not know yet, he said honestly. That is rather the point of tonight. The rest of the meal passed more easily than she expected. They spoke of small things, books she had read, places he had traveled before withdrawing from society, the strange quiet of the countryside at night. He asked about her family, and she answered carefully, choosing her words, not wanting to sound bitter even though bitterness sat closer to the surface than she liked to admit. He asked about her days, what she did with her time, and seemed genuinely surprised to learn how much of her life was spent in service to a household that rarely thanked her for it. That does not seem fair, he said simply. It is simply how things are, Alara replied, though even as she said it, she realized how tired she was of accepting that as an answer. As the final course was cleared away, the Duke rose from his seat and walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the dark grounds beyond. Alara watched him, uncertain whether the evening was ending. I do not know what tonight means, he said, without turning around. I only knew that I wanted to meet you properly, away from the noise of a crowded room, away from titles and expectations. I wanted to know if the woman I saw that evening was as genuine as she appeared, or whether I had simply imagined something that was not truly there. And what have you decided? Alara asked softly. He turned to face her, and for the first time all evening, something in his expression softened completely, the careful distance falling away. I have decided, he said, that I would very much like to see you again. Alara's heart quickened, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly on her face. My family will have questions, she said. They already believe there has been some mistake. Then let them ask their questions, the Duke said. The invitation was never a mistake. I chose you, Miss Whitmore, deliberately and with full understanding of what I was doing. Those words settled into her chest and stayed there, warm and unfamiliar, the way sunlight feels after a long winter. No one had ever chosen her before, not over Camille, not over anyone. She had spent her whole life being the one left behind, the one considered second, the one whose name people forgot to mention. And now, standing in the candle-lit warmth of a stranger's home, she felt, for the first time in years, that she mattered. "I would like that as well," she said quietly, "to see you again." He walked her to the door himself, past Nathaniel, who bowed respectfully and said nothing, out into the cool night air where her carriage waited. Before she stepped inside, the Duke took her hand briefly, his fingers warm against her cold ones. "Thank you," he said, "for being exactly who I hoped you would be." The carriage ride home passed in a blur. Alara stared out the window at the dark countryside sliding past, replaying every word of the evening in her mind, still unable to fully believe it had happened. When the carriage finally pulled up to her family's modest house, she noticed a single candle burning in the front window. Her mother was waiting. The moment Alara stepped through the door, she was met with a barrage of questions, each one sharper than the last. What had he said? What had he asked? Had there truly been no mention of Camille at all? Alara answered as best she could, though she found herself reluctant to share every detail, wanting to protect the evening a little longer before it became something dissected and picked apart by her family's expectations. Camille stood in the doorway to the parlor, arms folded, watching the exchange with an expression Alara could not quite read. "He asked to see her again," her mother said finally, turning toward Camille as though delivering difficult news. Apparently the invitation was never a mistake at all. Camille's face remained carefully composed, though something flickered behind her eyes, quick and sharp, gone before anyone else could notice it. "How wonderful for you," Camille said, her voice smooth and even. "I am sure it will not be long before the whole town hears of it." There was something in the way she said it, calm on the surface but edged underneath, that made Alara's stomach tighten with unease. She did not yet know how right that unease would prove to be. By the following afternoon, the story had already begun to spread. Alara did not know how it had traveled so quickly, whether it was the driver who had brought her carriage, or one of the kitchen staff at Ashcombe Hall, or simply the nature of small towns where nothing important ever stayed quiet for long. All she knew was that when she walked into the market that morning to fetch bread for the household, 3 separate women turned to whisper to one another the moment they saw her. She kept her eyes forward and walked faster than usual. By the time she returned home, her mother was already standing at the door, arms crossed, an expression on her face that Alara had learned to recognize as trouble. "Mrs. Whitfield stopped me on the road," her mother said, her voice tight. "She wanted to know if it was true that the Duke of Ashcombe dined with you last night, alone, for hours." "It was one dinner, Mother," Alara said, setting the bread basket down carefully. "Not hours, not scandal." "It does not matter how long it was," her mother snapped. "It matters what people believe it was. Do you understand what this could mean for this family, for Camille?" Alara felt something tighten in her chest, an old, familiar frustration rising up before she could stop it. "For Camille," she repeated quietly. "Of course, it always comes back to Camille." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "That is unfair, and you know it." "Is it?" Alara asked, meeting her mother's gaze directly for perhaps the first time in years. "I have spent my whole life being told what is best for Camille, what will help Camille, what might embarrass Camille. Even this, something that happened to me, something that was, for once, entirely about me, has already become about her." Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Camille appeared in the doorway behind her, having clearly heard every word. "You do not need to defend me," Camille said coolly. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own reputation." "That is not what I meant," Alara began, but Camille had already turned and walked back into the house, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. The tension in the household did not ease over the following days. If anything, it grew worse. Word of the dinner had spread through the entire county by the end of the week, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until Alara barely recognized the story being whispered about her. Some said she had schemed her way into the Duke's favor. Others said she had used some trick to lure him away from Camille, who everyone had assumed was the intended match all along. A few, kinder but no less painful, simply pitied her, certain the whole affair would end in humiliation once the Duke realized his mistake and turned his attention back to where it truly belonged. Alara heard all of it in pieces, from neighbors who did not realize she was within earshot, from her mother's careful reports delivered with barely concealed disapproval, from Camille's occasional sharp remarks that cut deeper than she likely intended. She tried not to let it show how much it hurt. 5 days after the dinner, a second letter arrived at the Whitmore house, carried by the same formal messenger as before. This time, there was no confusion about who it was meant for. The envelope bore Alara's name alone, written in a hand she now recognized as the Duke's own, rather than his secretary's careful script. Her mother watched with a tight, unreadable expression as Alara opened it. The letter was brief. The Duke requested her company again, this time for an afternoon walk through the gardens at Ashcombe Hall, 3 days hence. He wrote that he understood the whispers currently circulating through town and wished her to know that they troubled him only in that they might cause her distress, not because he had any doubt about his intentions. Alara read the final line twice. "I choose my own company, Miss Whitmore, regardless of what others assume I should prefer." She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest for a moment longer than necessary. "Well," her mother asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced now with something closer to grudging curiosity. "He wishes to see me again," Alara said simply. "In 3 days." Camille, who had been sitting quietly by the window with her needlework, said nothing, though her hands stilled for a long moment before continuing their careful stitches. The 3 days passed slowly, filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Alara found herself replaying the dinner conversation over and over, trying to understand what exactly the Duke had seen in her, what quality she possessed that had drawn his attention when so many others had overlooked her entirely. She did not consider herself remarkable. She had spent her whole life being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that she was not. And yet a Duke, a man who could have his pick of any woman in the county, had chosen to notice her. When the day of the walk finally arrived, she dressed more simply than she had for the dinner, choosing a pale green gown of her own rather than borrowing from Camille again. Somehow, it felt important to arrive as herself this time, without pretense, without borrowed elegance. The carriage arrived promptly, and this time, when she stepped down at Ashcombe Hall, the Duke himself was waiting at the entrance rather than sending his secretary to greet her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and there was something warmer in his voice now, less formal than before. "I am glad you came." "You did ask so directly," Alara said. "It would have felt rude to refuse." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, one that reached his tired eyes and made him look, for a moment, years younger. "I have been told directness is not a quality most people appreciate in a Duke." "I find it refreshing," Alara said honestly. They walked together through the gardens behind the estate, a sprawling, slightly overgrown space that clearly had not received the same attention as the grand front lawn. Wildflowers grew in patches between neatly trimmed hedges, as though the garden itself could not decide whether it wanted to be wild or tamed. "I apologize for the state of it," the Duke said, noticing her gaze. "My mother used to tend it herself before she passed. I have never had the heart to hire someone else to do it properly. It feels like it should stay a little wild in her memory." "I think it is lovely this way," Alara said, and she meant it. There was something honest about the garden's imperfection, something that felt more real than the manicured perfection she had seen in wealthier households. They spoke as they walked, easily now, the careful formality of their first dinner replaced by something closer to genuine conversation. He told her more about his childhood, about a father who had been distant and demanding, about a mother whose warmth he still missed keenly, even years after her passing. She told him about her own family, choosing her words carefully at first, but finding that his quiet, patient listening made it easier to be honest than she expected. "Your sister does not approve of this," he said at one point, not quite a question. "My sister does not know what to make of it," Alara corrected. "For most of our lives, I have been the one standing behind her. I do not think either of us knows how to navigate it being the other way around, even briefly." "And your mother?" Alara hesitated. "My mother worries about what people think. She always has. I do not believe she means to be unkind. I think she simply does not know how to want something for me that does not somehow also serve Camille." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds lonely," he said finally. "It is," Alara admitted, surprised by how easily the truth came out, "though I have grown so used to it that I rarely notice any more. It has simply become how things are." "I understand that better than you might think," he said. "This house has felt much the same way for a long time. Full of people, in a sense, staff, visitors on occasion, and still entirely empty." They stopped near a small stone bench at the edge of the garden, and for a while neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the quiet afternoon air. Alara found that she did not feel the need to fill the silence, which surprised her. She had spent so much of her life feeling as though she needed to earn her place in a room through usefulness, through quiet service, through simply not being a burden. With him, the silence felt easy, comfortable, like something shared rather than something to be endured. "May I tell you something I have not told many people?" the Duke asked eventually. "Of course." "After my engagement ended, I convinced myself that solitude was safer. That if I kept people at a distance, I could not be disappointed by them, and they could not be disappointed by me. It became easier to be alone than to risk being truly known and found wanting." "And now?" Alara asked softly. He looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression that she had not seen before, not even during their dinner. "Now I find myself wondering if I have simply been wasting years I did not need to waste." Alara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply reaching out and letting her hand rest briefly beside his on the stone bench, close enough that their fingers nearly touched. Neither of them moved away. They remained in the garden until the light began to shift toward evening, and when it came time for her to leave, the Duke walked her back to the carriage himself, his manner quieter than before, as though the conversation between them had settled something in him that he had not expected to feel settled. "I would like to see you again," he said, the same words he had spoken at the end of their first dinner, though they carried more weight now. "I would like that too," Alara replied. As the carriage pulled away, she looked back once and saw him still standing at the gates, watching until the road curved and he disappeared from view. The ride home felt different this time, lighter somehow, though the unease that had settled in her chest over the past week had not entirely faded. She thought of Camille's careful, unreadable expressions, of her mother's grudging tolerance, of the whispers that continued to follow her through town no matter how quietly she moved. She did not yet know that while she had spent the afternoon in the garden, learning the quiet truths of a lonely Duke's heart, her mother and sister had been having a very different conversation back at the house, one that would set in motion events Alara could not yet begin to imagine. By the time she arrived home, the house was unusually quiet. Camille was nowhere to be found, her mother offering only a vague explanation about a visit to a neighboring family, her tone carefully neutral in a way that, had Alara been paying closer attention, might have struck her as suspicious. But her mind was still full of gardens and quiet confessions, of a Duke who had looked at her as though she were something worth keeping rather than something easily overlooked. She had no reason yet to suspect that the ground beneath her happiness had already begun, quietly and carefully, to shift. Camille returned home just after dark, her cheeks flushed from the evening air, though there was something in her expression that did not quite match the simple explanation her mother had offered earlier. "Where were you?" Alara asked, more out of habit than suspicion. "Visiting the Ashfords," Camille said smoothly. "You remember Lady Ashford, she has been asking after us for weeks." Alara did not think much of it at the time. She was too preoccupied with her own thoughts, with the memory of the garden, of quiet confessions shared beside a stone bench, of a man who had looked at her as though she mattered. She excused herself early and retired to her room, leaving her mother and sister alone in the parlor, their voices dropping to a low murmur she did not stay to overhear. Over the following weeks, the visits between Alara and the Duke became a quiet, steady rhythm. He sent for her every few days, sometimes for a simple afternoon walk, sometimes for tea in the small sitting room where they had first dined together. Each visit peeled back another layer of the careful distance he had built around himself, until Alara began to feel as though she were being trusted with something rare and fragile. He told her about his father, a stern man who had cared more for the estate's reputation than for his own son's happiness, who had arranged the broken engagement years ago not out of love but out of strategic advantage, and who had died before ever offering an apology for the pain that arrangement had caused. He told her about the years that followed, the isolation he had chosen for himself, the way society continued to circle him like vultures waiting for him to finally remarry and secure the family line, never once asking what he actually wanted. "They do not care who I choose," he told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, the wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. "They care only that I choose someone, and quickly, so the estate has an heir and the family name continues. It does not matter to them if I am happy. It matters only that I am useful." "That sounds exhausting," Alara said. "It is," he admitted, "which is part of why I find such relief in your company. You do not seem to want anything from me beyond the conversation itself." Alara considered that for a moment. "I suppose I do not know how to want things from people," she said. "I have spent so long being the one who is given very little that I never learned how to expect much in return." "That should not be something to be grateful for," the Duke said gently. "You deserve to expect a great deal, Alara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it, softly, carefully, as though testing whether he had earned the right to say it at all, made her chest tighten with a warmth she had never experienced before. "You may call me that," she said quietly, "if you like." "Then you must call me Alaric," he replied. "I find I would very much like to hear you say it." She did, and something settled between them in that moment, a quiet understanding that neither of them fully spoke aloud, but that both of them clearly felt. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore household, a very different kind of understanding was being reached. Camille had not, in fact, spent that evening visiting the Ashfords. She had gone instead to call upon an old family friend who happened to be connected, however distantly, to the Duke's household staff, and through careful, casual conversation, had learned a great deal about the growing bond between her sister and the reclusive Duke of Ashcombe. She returned home that night not with jealousy exactly, though there was certainly some of that mixed in, but with a cold, calculating clarity that had begun to take root the moment she first read the invitation meant. She still firmly believed for her. "He asks for her constantly now," Camille told her mother later that same week, once Alara had retired for the evening. "The staff say he has not entertained anyone else since the first dinner, not a single other visitor." Her mother's expression tightened. "This cannot continue," she said. "A title like that, an estate like that, should belong to a daughter who knows how to manage it, who understands how to conduct herself in society. Alara has never been prepared for that kind of life." "She has never been prepared for anything," Camille said, though there was less venom in it than there might once have been, replaced instead by something closer to frustration. "And yet somehow, this is the one thing that has fallen into her lap. We must find a way to remind the Duke of what he is truly choosing," her mother said slowly, an idea beginning to form behind her careful, calculating eyes. "Perhaps a proper introduction is in order. A formal one, where he might see you as you truly are, rather than relying on whatever picture your sister has painted for him." Camille considered this for a long moment, and if he still prefers her. Her mother's expression hardened. "Then we shall have to ensure he understands exactly what kind of family he would be marrying into, should he continue down that path. Every family has its complications, Camille, even the Whitmores. It would be a shame if certain complications became difficult to overlook. Camille did not ask what her mother meant by that, though something in her mother's tone left her uneasy. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever plan her mother had in mind was simply a matter of securing the family's future, of ensuring that the daughter best suited for such a life was the one who received it. She told herself that, and mostly she believed it. The following week, an invitation arrived at Ashcombe Hall, not from the Duke, but addressed to him, requesting the honor of his presence at a small gathering hosted by the Whitmore family. It was signed by Alara's mother, though Alara herself knew nothing of it until the Duke mentioned it during one of their afternoon visits. "Your mother has invited me to dine at your home," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "This coming Saturday." Alara felt a flicker of unease, though she could not quite place its source. "I did not know she had done so." "Is that a problem?" "No," Alara said, though she was not entirely certain that was true. "I simply was not aware." "I intend to accept," Alaric said. "I would like to see where you grew up, to understand you a little better beyond these gardens and this house." Alara nodded, forcing a smile she did not entirely feel. She could not shake the uneasy sense that something was being arranged around her, quietly and carefully without her full knowledge, though she could not have said exactly what. That evening, when she returned home, she found her mother and Camille deep in conversation, which stopped abruptly the moment she entered the room. "The Duke mentioned an invitation," Alara said carefully. "For Saturday?" "Yes," her mother said, her tone bright and pleasant in a way that did not entirely match the calculating look Alara had briefly caught in her eyes before she composed herself. "It seemed only proper that he be formally welcomed into our home, given how much time the two of you have been spending together." "That was thoughtful," Alara said, though something in her chest remained tight with unease. Camille said nothing, though she offered Alara a small, careful smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Saturday arrived quickly, the household bustling with preparations unlike anything Alara had seen in years. Her mother spared no effort, insisting on the finest tablecloth they owned, the good silver that was normally kept locked away for occasions that never seemed to come, flowers arranged carefully throughout the sitting room. Camille, too, prepared with unusual care, choosing a gown of deep crimson that suited her far better than anything she had worn in months, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to perfect. Alara dressed more simply, the same pale green gown she had worn to the garden, feeling suddenly and acutely aware of how plain she must appear next to her sister's careful elegance. When the Duke's carriage arrived that evening, the entire household gathered at the door to greet him, a level of formality Alara had never witnessed in her own home. Her mother greeted him with practiced warmth, her father, usually a quiet, withdrawn presence, offering a firm handshake and a rare smile. And then Camille stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a graceful curtsy, "it is such an honor to finally welcome you properly into our home." Alaric offered a polite bow in return, his expression courteous but distant, his eyes seeking out Alara almost immediately, as though reassuring himself of her presence in the room. Dinner proceeded pleasantly enough at first, the conversation flowing easily around the table, her father discussing matters of local interest, her mother steering the conversation with careful precision toward topics that might showcase Camille's accomplishments, her wit, her grace, her carefully cultivated charm. Alara watched it unfold with a growing sense of discomfort, recognizing the pattern immediately, though she said nothing, hoping perhaps that she was simply imagining intentions that were not truly there. But as the evening wore on, and her mother's comments grew increasingly pointed, and Camille's laughter grew increasingly practiced and performative, directed carefully toward the Duke at every opportunity, Alara's discomfort deepened into something closer to dread. She caught Alaric's eye once across the table, during a lull in the conversation, and saw in his expression something quiet and steady, a reassurance that seemed to say he understood exactly what was happening, and that it did not change anything for him. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Still, as the evening drew to a close, and her mother pulled Camille aside for one final quiet word before the Duke's departure, Alara could not shake the growing certainty that whatever peace she had found over the past weeks was about to be tested, in ways she was not yet prepared to face. The days following the dinner brought a change in the household that Alara could feel, but could not quite name. Her mother had grown quieter, more watchful. The kind of quiet that Alara had learned over the years usually meant careful planning rather than peace. Camille, too, had changed, her manner toward Alara shifting into something almost too pleasant, too accommodating, as though she were rehearsing kindness rather than feeling it. Alara told herself she was imagining things. She wanted to believe that the warmth growing between herself and Alaric could exist without complication, without her family finding some way to reach into it and pull it apart. But the unease she had felt during the dinner had not faded. If anything, it had settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. 10 days after the dinner at the Whitmore house, Alara arrived at Ashcombe Hall for what she believed would be another quiet afternoon visit, only to find Camille's carriage already waiting near the gates. Her stomach dropped. She stepped down from her own carriage slowly, watching as Nathaniel Cross, the Duke's secretary, emerged from the house looking faintly uncomfortable, his usual composed expression replaced by something closer to apology. "Miss Whitmore," he said, greeting her with a small bow, "I was not expecting you today." "I was invited," Alara said, confused, "as I have been most weeks." "Of course," Nathaniel said quickly. "It is only that your sister arrived unannounced not an hour ago. She said she had urgent family matters to discuss with His Grace, and could not wait for a formal invitation." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Urgent family matters. "I could not say, Miss Whitmore. I was not present for the conversation." Alara thanked him and made her way inside, her earlier lightness replaced now by a growing sense of dread. She found Alaric in the same sitting room where they had first dined together, standing near the window with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something guarded, something troubled. Camille sat nearby, composed and elegant as always, though there was a satisfaction in her eyes that she did not quite manage to hide when Alara entered the room. "Alara," Camille said smoothly, rising from her seat, "I did not realize you were expected today as well. How fortunate that we might all speak together." "What is happening?" Alara asked, looking between her sister and Alaric, whose expression remained carefully unreadable. "Your sister came to share some concerns," Alaric said carefully, "regarding your family's circumstances. Financial concerns primarily. She felt it important that I understand the full picture before things between us progressed any further." Alara's face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and anger. "Financial concerns," she repeated slowly, turning to face Camille directly. "You came here to discuss our family's debts." "I came here," Camille said, her voice calm and reasonable in a way that made Alara's anger burn hotter, "because I believed His Grace deserved to know the truth before he committed himself further to a family that has struggled financially for years. It seemed only fair that he understand what he might be marrying into." "That was not your decision to make," Alara said, her voice shaking now. "Someone had to make it," Camille replied, "since you clearly were not going to." Alaric stepped forward then, his expression firm. "I want to be clear," he said, addressing both sisters, though his eyes remained on Alara, "that whatever financial difficulties your family may face have no bearing on my feelings toward Alara. I did not choose to spend time with her because of what her family could offer me. I have more wealth than I know what to do with already. What I lacked was honesty and companionship and someone who did not want something from me beyond my company. That is what I found in her." Camille's composed expression flickered, just slightly, though she recovered quickly. "How noble," she said, though the words carried an edge. "I only hope to spare you future disappointment, Your Grace, should certain complications arise that Alara has not been entirely forthcoming about." "What complications?" Alara asked sharply. Camille hesitated for the first time. something almost like guilt crossing her features before it disappeared again. "Nothing that need concern us today," she said finally, rising to leave. "I have said what I came to say. I will leave you both to your afternoon." She swept from the room without another word, leaving Alara standing frozen in the middle of the sitting room, her heart pounding, humiliation and fury tangled together in a way she did not know how to untangle. "I am sorry," Alaric said quietly, once Camille's carriage could be heard departing down the drive. "I did not know she intended to visit until she was already here." "What complications was she referring to?" Alara asked, her voice tight. Alaric hesitated, and something in that hesitation made her stomach twist further. "She mentioned," he said carefully, "that your father's debts extend further than I had understood. That there had been some difficulty, in the past, with a business arrangement that ended poorly. She implied there might be more to the situation than has been shared with me." Alara felt her face grow hot with shame, not because the debts themselves embarrassed her, though they did, but because Camille had chosen to weaponize her family's hardship in such a calculated, deliberate way. "I did not tell you about our finances," Alara admitted quietly, "because they are not something I am proud of, and because I did not want you to see me as a burden, or worse, as someone seeking to benefit from your wealth. I have watched my mother arrange every aspect of Camille's life around the hope that she might marry well enough to save this family from ruin. I did not want you to believe I harbored the same intentions." "I never believed that," Alaric said, moving closer, his voice gentle now. "Not for a moment. Whatever your sister hoped to accomplish today, it has not changed how I feel about you." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt, any hesitation that might suggest otherwise, but found none. Still, the events of the afternoon had shaken something loose inside her, a quiet, familiar fear that had followed her for most of her life. "I am afraid," she admitted softly, "that no matter what happens between us, my family will always find some way to interfere. That they will not rest until they have found a way to turn this into something that benefits them, rather than something that simply belongs to me." Alaric took her hand gently. "Then we shall face that together," he said. "I have spent years allowing my family's expectations and society's demands to dictate my choices. I do not intend to allow your family to dictate mine as well." His words offered comfort, but as Alara rode home that evening, the unease in her chest had not fully lifted. She thought of the guilt she had glimpsed briefly in Camille's expression before it vanished, of the mention of complications her sister had refused to fully explain, and she could not shake the feeling that whatever her family was planning, this afternoon's visit had been only the beginning. She was right to be uneasy. Over the following 2 weeks, the visits from Camille to Ashcombe Hall did not stop, despite Alara's protest to her mother, despite Alaric's clear and repeated insistence that his feelings would not be swayed. Camille found reason after reason to call upon the Duke, sometimes accompanied by their mother, sometimes alone, always with some new piece of information framed carefully as concern rather than manipulation. She spoke of an old family scandal, exaggerated well beyond its true proportions, involving a distant cousin who had once been asked to leave a position under questionable circumstances. She spoke of Alara's quiet nature, framing it not as thoughtfulness but as strangeness, suggesting perhaps that her sister struggled to connect with others in ways that might prove difficult for a duke's wife, who would be expected to host, to entertain, to charm visiting dignitaries with ease. Each visit chipped away, not at Alaric's feelings, which remained steady, but at the fragile peace Alara had only just begun to build for herself. She began to dread the sound of a carriage on the road, uncertain whether it carried an invitation for her or news of her sister's latest interference. She began to second-guess herself in Alaric's presence, wondering what doubts Camille might have planted that he was simply too kind to voice aloud. "You have grown quiet," Alaric observed one afternoon as they walked together through the garden, the wildflowers now beginning to fade with the changing season. "Quieter than usual, I mean, even for you." "I am tired," Alara admitted. of feeling as though every moment of peace I find must be defended, fought for, protected from people who claim to love me. Alaric stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Do you doubt me?" he asked, his voice careful. "No," Alara said honestly. "I doubt myself. I doubt whether I am strong enough to withstand however long my family intends to continue this, whether I will still recognize the person I was becoming with you by the time they finally exhaust themselves." "You will not have to withstand it alone," Alaric said firmly. "I have watched you endure years of being overlooked, undervalued, treated as though your feelings mattered less than your sister's ambitions. I do not intend to stand by and watch that continue, not when it is within my power to stop it." Alara wanted desperately to believe him, and in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by fading wildflowers and the steady warmth of his presence, she nearly did. But that evening, when she returned home, she found her mother waiting in the parlor with an expression Alara had come to recognize all too well, one that meant another plan had been set into motion, one far more serious than casual visits and whispered concerns. "We must speak," her mother said, gesturing for Alara to sit. "About your future, and about a decision that must be made for the good of this entire family." Alara sat down slowly, dread pooling heavy in her stomach, sensing that whatever her mother was about to propose would test the fragile happiness she had fought so hard to protect more severely than anything that had come before. "What decision?" Alara asked, though something in her chest already braced itself for the answer. Her mother folded her hands carefully in her lap, choosing her words with the same deliberate precision she used when discussing anything she considered delicate. "Your father received word today," she said, "that the debt owed to Mr. Harlan Pierce has grown beyond what we can manage to repay through ordinary means. He has given us until the end of the month before he takes the matter to court." Alara felt the weight of the words settle over her slowly. She had known, vaguely, that her family's finances were strained, but she had never fully understood the extent of it, had never been trusted with the details the way Camille sometimes was. "What does this have to do with me?" Alara asked, though she suspected she already knew. Her mother met her eyes directly. "You are close to the Duke of Ashcombe, closer than any of us imagined possible when this began. A loan, arranged discreetly, would resolve this matter entirely, and would cost him very little in comparison to what he clearly already possesses." Alara felt something cold spread through her chest. "You wish for me to ask him for money?" "I wish for you to consider the future of this family," her mother said, her voice sharpening slightly. "Do you understand what will happen to your father if this debt goes unpaid? To all of us. We could lose this house entirely. And you believe the solution is for me to use my relationship with Alaric to extract money from him," Alara said slowly, each word feeling heavier than the last. "As though what exists between us were nothing more than a transaction to be exploited." "I believe," her mother said carefully, "that you are in a position to help this family for once rather than simply being a burden upon it." The words struck harder than her mother likely intended, or perhaps exactly as intended. Alara sat in silence for a long moment, the familiar sting of being reduced to her usefulness settling over her once again, even now, even after everything. "I will not ask him for money," Alara said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. "Whatever happens to this family's finances, I will not turn what exists between Alaric and myself into something transactional. If you wish to ask him yourself, you may, but I will have no part in it." Her mother's expression hardened, though she said nothing further that evening, simply rising and leaving the room with a cold, disappointed silence that lingered long after she had gone. Alara did not sleep well that night, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation, around the growing realization that her family's desperation had reached a point where they were willing to use her, and her relationship with Alaric as a means to an end, regardless of how it might affect either of them. She did not yet know that her mother had no intention of letting the matter rest simply, because Alara had refused. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Ashcombe Hall, though not from Alara. It came instead from her mother directly, addressed to the Duke, though Alara would not learn of its existence until much later. The letter was carefully written, each word chosen to paint a picture entirely different from the truth. It spoke of the family's dire financial situation, framing it as a matter of urgent, desperate need. It suggested, though never stated outright, that Alara's continued visits to Ashcombe Hall had always been undertaken with the family's circumstances in mind, that her quiet nature and apparent disinterest in wealth were simply a more subtle strategy than her sister's obvious ambition, one designed to appear genuine while achieving the same eventual result. It was, in its way, a masterwork of careful implication, suggesting everything while stating almost nothing that could be directly disproven. Alaric read the letter alone in his study, the fire burning low beside him, and felt something in his chest twist painfully with doubt he had not expected to feel. He told himself at first that it was simply a desperate mother's attempt to secure her family's future, nothing more. He reminded himself of every conversation he had shared with Alara, every moment of quiet honesty in the garden, every instance where she had seemed genuinely uninterested in his title or his wealth, more concerned with simply being seen and understood. But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing regardless of how carefully one tries to uproot it. He found himself replaying their conversations with new suspicion, wondering whether her reluctance to discuss her family's finances had truly been born of shame, as she claimed, or whether it had been a careful omission designed to avoid raising exactly the kind of doubt now settling over him. He thought of how easily her family had arranged that formal dinner, how quickly the invitations to Ashcombe Hall had followed the first, how conveniently Camille's visits had continued despite his repeated assurances that his feelings would not be swayed. Had he been foolish? Had loneliness made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation he had spent years trying to avoid? He did not send for Alara that week, nor the week after. Alara noticed the silence immediately, though she told herself at first that it meant nothing, that he was simply occupied with estate matters, or unwell, or any number of ordinary explanations that did not involve her at all. But as the days stretched into a second week without word, the familiar dread she had carried for most of her life began to creep back in, whispering that perhaps this had all been too good to last, that perhaps she had been foolish to believe someone might choose her, truly and completely, without eventually finding a reason to change their mind. She finally worked up the courage to send a letter of her own, simple and direct, asking only whether something had happened, whether she had done something to cause his silence. His reply, when it finally came, was brief and formal, entirely unlike the warmth she had grown accustomed to in his correspondence. He wrote that he required some time to consider certain matters that had recently come to his attention, and that he would send word once he had reached some clarity. Alara read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening the ache in her chest. She did not understand what had changed, what matters he referred to, why the man who had held her hand so gently in the garden, who had promised to face whatever came together, had suddenly retreated behind walls of formal, distant language. She did not know, not yet, about her mother's letter. It was Camille, unexpectedly, who finally revealed the truth, though not entirely by choice. Alara found her sister in the garden behind their home one afternoon, sitting alone on a small bench, her expression troubled in a way Alara had rarely seen. She had come outside intending simply to walk off some of the restless anxiety that had settled into her since Alaric's silence began. But the sight of Camille, uncharacteristically still and pensive, made her pause. "What is wrong?" Alara asked, sitting down beside her sister despite the tension that had existed between them for weeks. Camille was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Mother wrote to him," she said finally, her voice quieter than Alara had ever heard it. "A letter, several days ago, about the family's debts. I did not know the full contents until I found the draft in her writing desk this morning." Alara felt her stomach drop. "What did it say?" Camille hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to their mother and something that looked almost like guilt over the growing distance between her sister and the man she had once resented her for capturing. "It suggested," Camille said carefully, "that your interest in him has always been strategic, that your quiet nature was simply a more careful approach than mine, but no less calculated." Alara felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. "That is not true." "I know that," Camille said, surprising her. "I did not always believe it, not at first, but I have watched you these past months, Alara. I have seen how you speak of him, how your whole manner changes when his name is mentioned. Whatever I once believed about your intentions, I do not believe them any longer." "Then why did you not stop her?" Alara asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" Camille's composure finally cracked, something raw and regretful showing through. "Because I was jealous," she admitted quietly. "Because for the first time in my life something wonderful happened to you instead of me, and I did not know how to sit with that gracefully. I told myself I was protecting this family, but truthfully, some small, ugly part of me was relieved when I saw your happiness begin to unravel. I am not proud of that, Alara. I am telling you now because I cannot continue watching mothers scheme destroy something that might actually be good, simply because I was too selfish to speak sooner." Alara sat in stunned silence, the revelation settling over her slowly, painfully. She did not know whether to feel angry or grateful, betrayed or comforted, and found herself feeling some tangled combination of all four at once. "I need to see him," Alara said finally, rising from the bench. "I need to explain before this misunderstanding costs me everything I have only just begun to build." "He will not simply believe you, not after a letter like that," Camille warned. "Mother was very careful in what she wrote. Nothing in it can be easily disproven with words alone." "Then I will have to find another way," Alara said, determination settling over the fear that had gripped her for the past 2 weeks. "I will not let this family's desperation take away the one thing that has ever truly been mine." Camille rose as well, something resolved settling into her own expression. "Let me help you," she said. "I owe you that much at least, perhaps more." For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the two sisters stood together, united by something other than resentment or competition, and began, carefully, to plan how they might undo the damage their mother's desperation had already set into motion. Neither of them yet knew whether it would be enough. That evening, when their mother returned from an afternoon visit to a neighboring estate, she found both of her daughters waiting for her in the parlor, standing side by side in a way that immediately told her something had changed. "What is this?" she asked, removing her gloves slowly, her eyes moving between them with careful suspicion. "We found your letter," Camille said before Alara could speak, "the one you sent to the Duke of Ashcombe." Their mother's face paled slightly, though she recovered her composure quickly, straightening her shoulders in the way she always did when preparing to defend herself. "I did what was necessary for this family," she said. "Someone had to think of our future." "You lied to him," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You told him I had been scheming for his fortune this entire time. You took the one honest, genuine thing in my life and twisted it into something ugly, simply to protect a debt that was never mine to solve." "I told him the truth about our circumstances," her mother said defensively. "I only suggested that perhaps your interest in him was not entirely separate from those circumstances." "You suggested I was lying to him," Alara said, her voice rising now, years of quiet compliance finally breaking apart. "You have spent my entire life treating me as though I existed only to serve this family's needs, only to be useful when convenient and invisible when not. I have accepted that, mother, for years, because I did not believe I deserved anything different, but I will not accept it now. Not when it threatens to destroy the first thing that has ever truly been mine." Her mother opened her mouth to respond, but Camille spoke first, stepping forward with an expression of quiet determination Alara had never seen from her before. "She is right, mother," Camille said. "I have watched you spend years favoring me, shaping every decision in this household around my prospects, my marriage, my future, while Alara was left to manage whatever remained. I let it happen because it benefited me, and I am ashamed of that now. But this, what you have done to her, to something good and real. This is beyond anything I am willing to accept quietly." Their mother stood frozen for a long moment, clearly unprepared for both of her daughters to stand united against her. Something in her expression flickered, defensiveness giving way slowly to something closer to shame, though she did not fully soften. "I only wanted to protect this family," she said quietly, though the conviction in her voice had weakened considerably. "Then let me protect it my own way," Alara said. "By being honest, and by refusing to let fear and desperation destroy the one good thing to come out of all of this." She turned and left the room without waiting for a response, her heart pounding, her mind already racing ahead to what she needed to do next. The following morning, Alara requested a carriage to Ashcombe Hall, though she carried no invitation this time, only a letter of her own, carefully written the night before, explaining everything: her family's debts, her mother's desperate letter, the painful, complicated history that had led to that moment of betrayal. She did not know whether Alaric would agree to see her, whether the damage done by her mother's careful, calculated implications could be undone by words alone. But she had to try. The journey felt longer than any she had taken before, each mile stretching her nerves tighter, until by the time the carriage finally rolled to a stop before the familiar iron gates, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely manage the door herself. Nathaniel Cross met her at the entrance, his expression unusually solemn. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "His Grace did not send for you today." "I know," Alara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear pooling in her stomach. "I need to see him regardless. It is important, Mr. Cross, more important than anything I have ever asked of you." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something in her expression apparently convincing him, because he nodded slowly and led her inside without further protest. She found Alaric in his study, the same room where, days earlier, he had read the letter that shattered the fragile trust they had built together. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded, careful, nothing like the warmth she had grown so accustomed to over the past months. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet, "I did not expect you." "I know," she said, stepping further into the room, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. "I came because I could not let things remain as they are between us without at least trying to explain." Alaric said nothing, simply watching her with an expression that gave away little of what he was thinking. "My mother wrote to you," Alara continued, forcing the words out despite how badly her voice wanted to shake. "I did not know until yesterday. She told you things that were not true, twisted the truth of our circumstances into something ugly, something calculated, because she is desperate and afraid and did not know any other way to solve a debt that threatens to take everything from our family." "And is it true?" Alaric asked quietly. "The debt?" "Yes," Alara said honestly. "That much at least is true. My father owes a significant sum, and if it goes unpaid, we may lose our home entirely. But what is not true, Alaric, is that I ever cared for you because of what you could offer this family. I refused when my mother asked me to seek help from you directly. I told her I would not turn what exists between us into something transactional, no matter what it cost my family in return." Alaric was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Alara felt the silence stretch painfully between them, each second feeling heavier than the last. "I wanted to believe that," he said finally. "When her letter arrived, some part of me wanted desperately to dismiss it entirely. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of people wanting only what my title could provide, could not fully silence the doubt it created." "I understand," Alara said softly, though the words hurt to say. "I know what it is to be shaped by years of feeling unwanted for yourself alone. I only hoped, foolishly perhaps, that what existed between us was strong enough to withstand my family's desperation." "It is not foolish," Alaric said, moving closer now, something softening in his expression for the first time since she had entered the room. "I have spent the past 2 weeks trying to reconcile the doubt her letter created with everything I know to be true of you, every quiet, honest moment we have shared. I think, if I am honest with myself, I already knew the truth. I simply needed time to trust it fully again. And do you, Alara asked, hardly daring to hope, trust it? Alaric reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers, warm and steady in a way that eased some of the fear that had gripped her chest for the past 2 weeks. I trust you, he said. I should never have allowed a single letter, however carefully crafted, to shake what I have come to know of your character these past months. I am sorry for the silence, for the doubt. You did not deserve either. Relief flooded through Alara so powerfully that she felt tears gathering, unbidden, at the corners of her eyes. I was so afraid, she admitted quietly, that I had lost this, that my family's desperation had cost me the one thing that ever truly felt like mine. You have not lost anything, Alaric said, his voice firm now, certain. If anything, this has only made me more certain of what I want. I am tired of allowing fear, mine or anyone else's, to dictate my choices. I choose you, Alara. Deliberately and completely, regardless of what your family owes, regardless of what doubts others might try to plant between us. He drew her closer, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the quiet of his study, the fragile trust between them not just repaired but strengthened by having survived its first true test. There is something else, Alara said eventually, pulling back slightly to look up at him. My family's debt still stands. I did not come here today to ask for your help with it, and I will not, no matter how dire things become. But I wanted you to know the full truth of my circumstances, without concealment, so that whatever choice you make going forward, you make it with complete honesty between us. Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. I appreciate that honesty, he said finally, and I will consider what, if anything, I choose to do about your family's circumstances separately, as my own decision made freely, and not as something extracted from me through manipulation or obligation. But that is a matter for another day. Today, I am simply glad to have you back in this house, and to know that whatever comes next, we face it with nothing hidden between us. Alara felt something settle in her chest, a quiet, steady certainty she had not experienced in a very long time. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever her family's desperation might attempt next, she no longer faced them alone. She had found, finally, someone who chose her. Not out of obligation, not out of convenience. Simply because she was, at last, exactly who he wanted. The weeks that followed brought a change to the Whitmore household that no one, least of all Alara, could have fully anticipated. Her mother, humbled by the confrontation in the parlor and the quiet knowledge that both of her daughters now stood united against her scheming, grew noticeably more careful in her words and actions, though the change did not come easily or entirely without resentment. Old habits Alara had learned rarely disappeared overnight, and there were still moments when her mother's careful comments carried echoes of old expectations. But the outright manipulation had stopped, replaced by something closer to cautious respect, even if it remained imperfect. Camille, surprisingly, became something of an ally in the months that followed, the resentment that had colored so much of their relationship slowly giving way to a fragile but genuine closeness neither sister had expected to find. She visited Ashcombe Hall occasionally, not to interfere this time, but simply to spend time with her sister, and gradually, even Alaric began to warm toward her, recognizing in her honest apology the same courage he had come to admire in Alara. Their father's debt remained a quiet, persistent concern throughout those months, discussed carefully within the family but never raised directly with Alaric, exactly as Alara had insisted. She was determined that whatever grew between herself and the Duke would remain entirely separate from her family's financial troubles, uncorrupted by even the appearance of obligation. It was Alaric himself who eventually raised the matter, nearly 2 months after the confrontation in his study, during a quiet evening spent together in the garden that had, by then, become something of a shared sanctuary for them both. I have been thinking about your father's debt, he said carefully, watching her reaction closely. Alara felt herself tense slightly, old fears rising despite the trust they had built together. I told you, Alaric, I do not wish for you to feel obligated. I know, he interrupted gently. And I am not offering out of obligation. I am offering because I care for your family, difficult as they have sometimes been, and because I have the means to help without any real hardship to myself. I would like to settle the debt, quietly, as a gift, with no expectation attached beyond the simple wish to see your family free of a burden that has caused you so much pain. Alara felt tears gathering, though this time they came from gratitude rather than fear. You do not have to do this, she said softly. I know that as well, Alaric said. Which is precisely why I wish to. She accepted eventually, after much careful discussion about the terms, insisting that it be treated as a private arrangement rather than a public gesture, wanting to avoid any suggestion that their relationship had ever been built upon financial convenience. When her mother learned of the gift, her reaction was a complicated mixture of relief and shame, the debt's resolution bringing genuine gratitude that finally softened some of the hard edges that had defined her behavior for months. I owe you an apology, her mother said one evening, finding Alara alone in the garden of their own modest home, the late summer light casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. A proper one, not the careful half-apologies I have offered before. Alara looked up, surprised by the directness in her mother's tone. Go on, she said quietly. I spent so many years believing that Camille's beauty and charm were this family's only path to security, her mother said, sitting down beside her daughter, her expression tired in a way Alara had rarely seen. I convinced myself that your quiet nature meant you required less from me, less attention, less investment, because you did not demand it the way your sister sometimes did. I told myself I was simply being practical, but the truth is, I failed you, Alara. I failed to see you clearly, and when the one good thing to happen to you finally arrived, my first instinct was to protect what I had always prioritized rather than celebrate what you had found. Thank you, Alara said softly, for saying that. I do not expect it to undo years of neglect, her mother continued. But I hope, in time, I might earn back some measure of the trust I have clearly lost. It was not a complete resolution, not the kind of tidy, immediate forgiveness that might exist in simpler stories, but it was a beginning, and Alara found that she was willing to accept it as such, choosing to believe that people, even those who had hurt her deeply, were capable of growth when given the chance. As autumn settled over the countryside, painting the fields in gold and amber, Alaric began speaking more seriously about the future, about what a life together might look like, about the responsibilities and expectations that would come with formally joining their two families. Alara found herself both excited and nervous at the prospect, aware that stepping fully into the role of a duke's wife would bring challenges far beyond anything she had yet experienced. You are worried, Alaric observed one evening, as they sat together near the fire in his study, the same room where their trust had once nearly shattered and had since been rebuilt into something far stronger. I am, Alara admitted. I have spent my whole life being overlooked, Alaric. I do not know how to be seen by an entire society, how to host gatherings and manage an estate, and represent a family name that carries such weight. You will learn, Alaric said gently, as I did and as everyone does, but you will not learn it alone, and you will not learn it while pretending to be someone you are not. I did not fall in love with a woman skilled in performing grace for an audience. I fell in love with someone honest, someone kind, someone who noticed a stumbling stranger at a crowded gathering when no one else thought to look. That is the woman I wish to stand beside me, exactly as she is. Alara felt her breath catch slightly at his words, at the quiet certainty in his voice. You have never said that before, she said softly. That word. Alaric smiled, something warm and unguarded crossing his tired eyes. I have felt it for some time, he admitted. I simply did not know how to say it until now. I love you, Alara. Not despite your quiet nature, not despite your family's complications, but because of the honest, steady heart beneath all of it, the one that chose kindness in a room full of people who had long since forgotten how. I love you too, Alara said, the words coming easily, naturally, after months spent building trust from the ground up. I have for some time now, though I was too afraid to say it aloud, uncertain whether happiness like this was something I was truly allowed to keep. You are allowed, Alaric said firmly, taking her hand in his. "You have always been allowed, Alara. You simply needed someone to remind you of that." He rose from his seat then, and for a moment Alara thought he simply meant to stoke the fire, but instead he knelt before her, producing a small velvet box from his coat pocket, his hands, usually so steady, trembling slightly with a nervousness that made her heart swell with tenderness. "I have spent years believing that solitude was safer than the risk of being truly known," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "You have taught me otherwise. You have shown me that being known, fully and honestly, by someone who chooses you regardless, is worth every risk that comes with it. Alara Whitmore, would you marry me?" Alara felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, joy overwhelming every lingering fear that had followed her for so many years. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with happiness. "Yes, Alaric, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, and when he rose to embrace her, she felt, for the first time in her entire life, completely and wholly chosen. News of the engagement spread through the county even faster than the rumors that had followed their first dinner, though this time, the whispers carried a different tone entirely. Gone was the pity, the suspicion, the assumption that Alara had somehow tricked her way into fortune. In its place grew something closer to admiration, as the true story gradually emerged, the quiet, genuine courtship between a lonely duke and the overlooked sister who had captured his heart not through scheming, but through simple, unwavering honesty. Camille stood beside her sister on the day of the wedding, serving as her attendant with a warmth that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Their mother watched from the front row, tears in her eyes that seemed, for once, entirely genuine, free of calculation or hidden agenda. Even their father, usually reserved, could not fully hide his pride as he walked Alara down the aisle toward the man waiting patiently at its end. Ashcombe Hall, once known throughout the county as cold and empty, began slowly to fill with warmth in the months that followed, its halls no longer echoing with silence but with laughter, with quiet conversation, with the steady sound of two lives being built together rather than endured separately. The garden that Alaric's mother had once tended, left wild in her memory for so many years, was gradually restored, not to rigid manicured perfection, but to something balanced between wild beauty and careful care, much like the love that had grown between the two people who now walked its paths together each evening. Alara often thought back, in quiet moments, to the girl she had once been, standing frozen in her family's parlor as a letter fell to the floor, certain that whatever it contained could not possibly be meant for her. She thought of years spent believing herself invisible, unworthy of attention, forever destined to stand in her sister's shadow. She understood now that she had never truly been unworthy, only unseen by people too preoccupied with surface and performance to notice the quiet, steady strength beneath. It had taken a lonely duke, tired of pretense himself, to finally look closely enough to see her clearly. And once seen, she had never again allowed herself to disappear. Years later, when their own children ran laughing through the gardens of Ashcombe Hall, Alara would sometimes tell them the story of how their parents met, of an invitation that arrived at the wrong house, addressed to the wrong sister, or so everyone believed at the time. But it had never truly been a mistake at all. It had simply been the moment someone finally looked past the noise of expectation and saw her, fully and completely, for exactly who she was. And in seeing her, he had given her, at last, the one thing she had spent her whole life quietly hoping for. A place where she belonged, chosen freely and loved without condition.